Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. Derek Lambert, I'm your host. I'm going to be joined today by an expert on the Gospels. They have done extensive work. I've put their books in the description, and I sure hope that you go get a copy. Dr. James Barker, welcome back to Myth Vision.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be back.
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, you've written several books. The latest, greatest book. Tell our audience, in case they didn't watch the last episode, the name of the book. I'll actually try to, I don't know why I didn't pull this up, have it on Amazon ready to go. Writing and rewriting. I'm going to just pull you up by name, actually. That'll be easier.
Yeah, writing and rewriting the Gospels. And then the subtitle is John and the Synoptics. So in a nutshell, the thesis is that all our Gospels are interrelated. We start with Mark, and everyone who writes a later Gospel is copying off the earlier ones. So Matthew's using Mark. Luke is then using Matthew and Mark. And finally, John is using Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it is what I described through at various points throughout the book. It's simply a snowball effect. So you get one thing going and it builds, and everyone who writes later builds on what came before. And that gets us our four Gospels, and none of them is independent. And we don't need to make any appeals to hypothetical sources. We don't need to make any appeals to hypothetical compositional stages that we've reconstructed in our minds of, well, first there was this iteration of such and such gospel. We take the Gospels basically as we have them, longer ending of Mark being one exception, the woman caught in adultery in John being another. Except for that, we basically have what text critical scholars have reconstructed as our text and say, it's as close as we're going to get. Mark came first. Matthew used Mark. Luke used Matthew and Mark. John used all three of those synoptic Gospels.
So I'd like to ask you, because you work in the field. I was just texting with Hugo Mendez earlier, and then I was texting with Goodacre earlier. And you know me, I'm always like,
both great. Yeah. Goodacre wrote the foreword to my book. Hugo blurbed it. So great friends of mine, great minds.
I stay in good circles, and I did a recent video where I clapped back at a famous apologist named Wes Huff, who made some statements that I think were just a bit over the top, exaggerative. But, I kind of wanted to ask you about the consensus pertaining to the work you do. Seems like there's an overwhelming kind of conservative trend. You're one of the more ahead of your time, I would say, in terms of what you're doing with your Gospels. Would you agree that you're probably not in the majority when it comes to viewing the Gospels this way?
I honestly think, and this is something Mark Goodacre and I talk about a lot, I think it's really hard to know what the consensus is. So I'll try to keep this pontification brief. But here's what happens. If you look at consensus in terms of, let's just send out a survey to everybody, let's just say in the United States, who is a New Testament professor, and let's ask them their solution to the synoptic problem and whether they think John is related to one or more of the synoptics. The answers that you're going to get are going to be based primarily on what most of those scholars did in grad school, what they learned in grad school. Maybe they were in grad school 40 years ago or 20 years ago, like me, and so if say you're someone who works on Paul, and that's your sub area of expertise within New Testament studies, and you went to grad school 30 years ago, you're very likely to say the two source hypothesis using Q and Matthew's independence from Luke, right? Luke didn't need Matthew to write his gospel. He just had Mark and Q. That solves the synoptic problem. And John probably doesn't know any of the synoptics. So you could, in our hypothetical survey, be flooded with responses to that effect. But if you look at what's being published by the people who do source criticism of the Gospels,
right,
over, say, the last 5-10 years, well, you've got a great edited volume called John's Transformation of Mark that looked at John's use of Mark. Helen Bond, the main editor of that, Kitchen Williams, I'm probably forgetting someone. But just a who's who of contributors who all ended up thinking that John knows Mark. You look at Wendy North's book, What John Knew and What John Wrote. You look at my book, you look at Mark Goodacre's book, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, that John knows all 3 Synoptic Gospels. And then when you look at Synoptic Problem, well, it's all over the map. We have two-source hypothesis is not going away, but you've got these Farrer, that's the name of the theory I advocate for. I didn't make it up. Austin Farrer gets credit for it. He wasn't the first person ever to mention it, but that's what it's known as because of his famous article, an essay called On Dispensing with Q. Mm-hmm. If you look at people who publish on the Synoptic Problem, you might get Matthean posteriority, right? That Mark was written first, then Luke, and then Matthew was using Mark and Luke. Because that was being published, because it's new, because we haven't thought about it enough. I've thought about it a lot. I don't think it's convincing. But that when you look at what's being published in the field and the people doing it, that's a much smaller sample size to try to poll and say, hey, what do you think? So I think for people who work on John, it would be hard to say that there's a firm consensus that John doesn't use the Synoptics. If I had to guess today, I think you would say we've seen the tide turn back to John's use of the Synoptics. And for the Synoptic Problem, I kind of think that the Farrer hypothesis is neck and neck with the two-source hypothesis. I think there are a lot of us out there. We're not like quiet about it. We're not, keeping our thoughts to ourselves. These things are being published, and I'm not the only one. Mark Goodacre's not the only one, although he deserves a ton of credit, to be sure, for his work, The Case Against Q. That, for me, when I was in grad school, that does it. That settles it. I was predisposed to being a Q skeptic, but I was taught by a Griesbachian who still held the Matthean priority, and he told me, he said, don't believe this because I think it. Think for yourself. Figure it out for yourself. I found the Farrer hypothesis. We've got to hold the Mark in priority, but we don't need Q. And Luke's got to be using Matthew here, there, and everywhere. So I just think, I say all of that to say consensus is a funny thing. If it's just a survey of New Testament scholars, you got to then ask some follow-up questions of, well, have you actually published in this area? Is this your main area of focus? Because I'm not going to weigh in on a lot of Pauline arguments, right? Because I have not read all that secondary literature, just the stuff that's come out since I got my degree in 2011. That's a lot to wade through. So I think it's hard to nail down a consensus, but I think there's, if not, I wouldn't dare say what I think is the consensus, but I would say it is intriguing to a lot of scholars, and it is compelling for a lot of scholars. And there are enough of us out there saying, let's proceed this way. Because again, I didn't make any of this up. I'm not the first person to arrive at these conclusions, although I'm happy to take credit for the contribution that I've made. But I think others can take that and run with it, and then we'll see where we are in 10 years.
Yeah. Look, we already got a question from a fan and a major supporter of the channel, Doc Pluromanaut. Thank you so much. Feel free to super chat questions, comments, whatever. We'll be taking those. And they say, and thank you for being a member, Doc. What if the messianic secret isn't theology, but clumsy redaction? Early scenes know who Jesus is, Mark 1:24. Yet later edits impose silence to explain disbelief. Are these narrative scenes where competing traditions collide?
That's a good question, and the messianic secret is a huge issue. When we jump ahead to John, there is no messianic secret. Everybody knows who Jesus is. So we think primarily back to the classic work by Vreda on the messianic secret, particularly in Mark, that Jesus shushing anyone who calls him the Messiah as a way of saying, that no one even thought he was the Messiah in his day. And I think that goes way too far in the other direction. The question is, why is Jesus shushing people who call him the Messiah? And I do tend to see it as not exclusively as theological. I do think it's theological, especially when it's in the context of an exorcism. So when demons in Matthew, Mark, and Luke say Jesus is the Son of God, or Jesus is the Messiah, but primarily they call him Son of God, Jesus tells them to shut up, not to say that. Not because it isn't true, but it's an interesting thing. And in that case, it is, I think, theological. When Peter gets the nickname Peter in Matthew's gospel, he calls Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And when Matthew tacks on that Son of God, Jesus says, I don't know how you know that. My Father in heaven must have revealed that to you. Flesh and blood can't really know who I am. So that's more of the Son of God thing, which gets conflated with Messiah. They are distinct terms. The political side is calling Jesus Messiah will get you killed, right? Even if he's not claiming to be the Messiah, he never denies that he's the Messiah. He just tells people not to say it. And even when he enters into Jerusalem, the Pharisees, I think, sympathetically try to warn him, hey, the people are calling you a king. You might not want that. that might not lead to a good outcome. And of course they're right. And Jesus says, I'm not going to tell them to shut up. So it develops over the course of the narrative of the Synoptics as to Jesus's openness to receiving those kinds of acclamations and designations. And so I see it as more of primarily a literary device that again unfolds across the Gospels, that by the end, he'll accept everything. If you call him the Messiah, the Son of God, the King, all of those things, yes, I am. No matter what happens, even the crucifixion. It just takes us a while to get there. And that's a nice difference, contrast with John's Gospel, where there's no secret. Call me the King of Israel, call me the Savior of the world, call me the Son of God. It's all true all day long. And let's just start in chapter 1. John the Baptist can say it, and we'll just go from there with how many people know it. And Jesus is never going to shush anybody. I also think it's why John has no exorcisms. I think John has read Matthew, Mark, and Luke and is very uncomfortable with the idea that demons know Jesus to be the Son of God and humans don't. So he has numerous human characters calling Jesus the Son of God. So is it theological? Yeah. Is it exclusively theological? No. It's also a literary trope, but I don't think it's that clumsy, because I do think we see an increasing acceptance on the part of Jesus to receive those acclamations. And then I think that John just runs in the completely different direction. It's not as though, sometimes he wanted to be called Messiah, sometimes he didn't. And somehow these traditions were trying to find a way to fit them together. I think they fit together fairly well, and as they stand, and they just develop. And over time, Jesus becomes more comfortable saying, yeah, now is the time. Now's the time to say it, especially when he enters Jerusalem.
Before we move off of this, and thank you, Doc, again, big super chat here. I think of the messianic secret trope. You mentioned the trope. Would you maybe agree or disagree that trope has its commonality? Like, for example, when you look at Joseph in the Old Testament, let's just go to scripture first, or even Homer with Odysseus, but I wanted to stick to scripture, where he's right there, but they don't recognize him. And there's this kind of theme where the guy who's right in front of you the whole time, you don't realize who he is, but they're kind of hiding that secret of his identity in a sense.
Yeah. I think that works. And especially when I always point out in the Gospel of Mark, it is to the letter. If you go from start to finish, the exact midpoint of the gospel is the transfiguration story. And that is the turning point of our earliest gospel. And that is when 3 of Jesus's disciples see his metamorphosis.
Mm-hmm.
And they know he's something other, right? They hear the voice from heaven. And because in Mark's gospel, at the baptism, it is, "You are my son." Sounds like a private religious experience. "This is my son." The 3 disciples hear that at the transfiguration. Matthew likes that, steals it, puts it already at the baptism.
Right.
Like no spoiler alert, right? You just it's already out there. But for Mark, it is that unfolding. But like you say, they don't recognize who he really is. It's when he's walking on the water that they think he's a ghost, and he's like, "No, it's me," and they're terrified. And you should be scared of ghosts, right? So they don't. There is a theme of they don't always recognize him. And then when you carry that forward to the resurrection appearances, they really don't recognize him, or they see it and don't even believe it when he's standing right in front of them, or they mistake him for someone else. And then if you look at the apocryphal gospels and the apocryphal Acts, they take that idea and run with it, where, sometimes Acts of John will say he would look like a little kid. Sometimes he looked like an old man. Sometimes he was all flabby, and sometimes he was really ripped, and he was always appearing to us in these different forms. And it's easy for my students in the Bible Belt to read that and say, "Oh, that's heresy. That's not what the Bible says." And I say, well, it is kind of what the Bible says. It's just not fully explained why they misunderstood him, mistook him for someone else. And so these later texts, they're derivative, but they're just trying to flesh out something that's already there in your Gospels. We don't know what he looked like at the Transfiguration. We don't know why Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel thinks he's the gardener. We don't know why those two guys on the road to Emmaus in Luke's Gospel didn't know who he was until he broke the bread. So that idea of he's right here and you see him, but you don't fully get who he is. It's there. And like you say, it's there in other literature too. And so it's not unique to Jesus or the Gospels, but the Gospels like to play with that idea. And they tend to play with it more and more as they go along. But the walking on water is a key scene. The Transfiguration is definitely a key scene. Resurrection appearance is crucial to theology of the early church. The idea is they're seeing the risen Jesus, but they didn't know it was Jesus. And you think, why would you write the story that way? Because it would, right? If you're trying to convince people that Jesus rose from the dead, and you're doing that by saying, and when they saw him, they were like, "No way, that's Jesus." The people who knew him and spent however much time with him saw him but didn't recognize him. It's kind of a funny claim, and definitely an interesting take. Not how I would have written my gospel, but hey, right. I didn't write them.
Thank you, Bakken. Thank you so much for this, being a member for 19 months. They throw their membership question up. Thoughts about Mark being a gospel written by a political rabbinical Gentile who used some of Paul's letters to promote a reform against or amongst the Jews and bring them into the greater mystery religions?
Okay, there's a lot in there. Thank you very much for the question. First, for Paul, I think the Mark and Paul connection, I think, is very strong. And I haven't met Cameron Evan Ferguson, but I'm a huge fan of his work. And I think he lays this out as clearly as anyone I've seen. If you pick up the Oxford Handbook of the Synoptic Gospels, he has a chapter on one of the essays there is by him. It's on Paul's possible influence on the Synoptics, and he lays out the Eucharistic language in 1 Corinthians. He just shows this is what Mark is drawing on. Look, and it's brilliant. It is just a brilliant piece of scholarship, and I think he's got a whole book out now that is on my to-do list to track down. So I think everyone who wrote a gospel, all of our canonical gospels, I think are influenced by Paul to some degree. The issue, though, of is Mark more in a rabbinic circle, that's where I would disagree, because I think Mark is so thoroughly influenced by Paul I think Matthew is the reactionary, where Matthew wants to bring things back more Jewish, more Torah observant, because Mark plays at times. And a fellow Vanderbilt alumnus who studied under A.J. Levine, he was just doing a master's when I was doing my doctorate, and I first met him. And he started working on this idea of not just that Mark is very Pauline and anti-Jewish, but that Mark plays on distinctively Roman stereotypes against Jews. So a key example of that, he argued, Ricky Scheinel said that when Jesus heals the townspeople after he heals Peter's mother-in-law, that they wait until sundown, until Sabbath is over, is sort of this, don't break the Sabbath. And the idea that Romans think that Jews fast on the Sabbath because they don't understand there's a day of preparation, like they don't cook, but that doesn't mean that they don't eat. And you see this play out. So Myrick read very carefully and found these places where Mark sure seems to know Roman anti-Jewish stereotypes and use them to his advantage. And now that's a debate within New Testament scholars, but I'm persuaded by that camp. I think that Mark is thoroughly Pauline, so he's not really trying to bring everybody into, like, hey, bring all the Jews in. I think he's fine with a Pauline gospel that can be read as anti-Jewish, like, yeah, you don't have to keep Sabbath if you don't want to. And Matthew reads that, and I think is frankly offended by it, and thinks you at least have to keep Sabbath. Like, let's keep 10 commandments, Paul. Let's, cursed is anyone who breaks a commandment or teaches anyone to break a commandment. Not a single commandment shall pass away. Like, that's where I think Matthew is the one who's the reactionary, who's trying to bring more Torah observance back in to say, look, I'm not saying everybody has to convert to Judaism. In that regard, I don't think Paul's, wrong about everything. A broke clock's right twice a day, right? But I think we should be trying to keep more of Torah than Paul would lead you to believe, and that Mark would lead you to believe. And Matthew wants that. And then Luke's trying to iron out that conflict, that Peter-Paul conflict. And this goes back to the work of Ferdinand Christian Bauer 200 years ago in the Tübingen School. Now, he thought that Matthew was written first, and he thought that Matthew was he had it wrong in terms of like what came first and who was what. But in terms of Luke trying to iron out the differences, because he still held to this idea, the traditional idea that Mark was associated with Peter at Rome, and therefore Peter must be behind Mark's gospel. No. Paul is behind Mark's gospel. Matthew, I'm not saying the apostle Peter is directly behind it, but Matthew's is at least the gospel that's elevating the role of Peter as the founder of the church, the one who has the right to say to Paul, you're not an apostle. Well, then once they're both dead, it's silly to be fighting about it. What Bauer did get right is that Luke is trying to smooth out those differences. Luke knows good and well what he's doing in Luke and in the book of Acts, of saying, we can have a big tent. Why can't we all just get along? Because it's silly to argue, I listened to Peter, I listened to Paul, when both of them were dead.
Right. Baca,
so bringing Matthew's back in, that's Matthew's gospel. But then Matthew's gospel also ends with, and now preach this very Torah observant gospel to all the Gentiles. And I think that does create some tension, a tension that Luke then finds it necessary to try to mediate.
Wow. So much there to unpack. Next question is Doc Pleromanot again. Thank you so much, Doc. If Mark comes from the Barnabas Jerusalem orbit, yet editorializes food law abolition, Does Papias's Petrine framing represent an early Catholicizing attempt to harmonize Jerusalem and Gentile missions?
I'll say, maybe. I don't think ultimately we know where Mark comes from, and I don't tend to see him in Jerusalem. I mean, I do. There's an article, and sorry the name escapes me, but I was talking to somebody who mentioned it to me because it's something I was thinking about when I was writing my book, but I didn't put it in the book. And somebody was like, somebody's published on this. This line that we have that says, "Thus he declared all foods clean," doesn't actually have to be translated that way. It's literally can be translated as saying, once your body eliminates the waste, the uncleanness is gone. So I still think there's something there because Matthew and Luke eliminate that line, right? So they see it as, well, you can read this as the abolition of food laws, and we definitely don't want something that anti-Torah. But what Mark actually says may not mean that, which I think we need to think more about. And again, I apologize to whoever had the courage to publish on it. And, something I thought about just as I was translating. I was like, I've been saying this for years in class and being taught this and teaching this. And I never really thought, if you look at the Greek, it might not mean that. It might actually be talking about a bodily function. And that's that. And at that point,
if you take Paul's background into it, would you say it gives some credence to the idea that you're seeing a radical break from Torah?
Yeah, that's what I think Matthew's afraid of. Yeah. So that's why I think Matthew does not have, thus he, even if you go with that translation, thus he declared all foods clean. I think Matthew knows that is a way to interpret that verse, and he wants no part of that, and that is why that's excised. But I don't know that we can say with any degree of certainty who Mark was at all. I think it's fair to say, stop saying that he's associated with Peter at Rome. Mm-hmm. I think we have to make that break and say that's early tradition that doesn't hold any credence. Did Mark editorialize the food law abolition? Probably that's Mark. Yeah, that's Mark's take on it. But again, if you translate it as meaning the elimination of the waste renders there's nothing unclean in that, we just start over, then it wouldn't be as strong. But Matthew certainly thought that it was a problematic statement that needed to be stricken. So he did. Do we want to, is he trying to harmonize Jews and Gentiles? I don't think Mark has a really strong Jewish focus. I think he's just very thoroughly Pauline. And I also try not to speculate much in terms of gospel audiences. I think the Gospels are written literally for anybody who could read them or have them read to them. So, this debate, Richard Bauckham edited the volume, The Gospels for All Christians, to try to get away from this idea that the Gospels are written within specific communities. I agree with ditching the community approach, like Robin Walsh has done, like our Dr. Foster Stan Stowers did, like stop it with this community talk. I'm totally on board with that. But I don't stop, as Bauckham did, with the Gospels for all Christians. I say, why not the Gospels for everybody? Every literate person or everybody who just liked to listen to things being read around. Ian Mills has a great article on pagan readers of the Gospels. So we know that the Gospels are being read widely very early. And I think that's just what we should assume any piece of writing was intended to do at the earliest. So trying to pin down when, where, for whom, it's such a trap. It's a big one. It's trapped us all for centuries of New Testament scholarship. But I think if we see it as a trap, we just kind of build this imaginary bridge and just like Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff. Just don't look down, and you can keep going. And we don't need to fall into that trap of exactly when and where, by whom, for whom were these written. But we can say Mark's gospel has a really heavy Pauline thrust that does, to me, seem more interested in a Gentile audience. Matthew clearly has this drives me up the wall when people say Matthew was a Jew writing for Jews.
Right.
He literally ends his gospel by saying, now take this to all the Gentiles. So it is for the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the Jews, as he says clearly in chapter 10. But in the Great Commission, he very clearly says, and now it's for all the Gentiles too. So the only people he leaves out are the Samaritans. Well, Luke and John, well, at least John and Acts take care of the Samaritans for us. But I do think Matthew is for everybody, but saying at least some of Torah is for everybody. But even Paul agrees with that, right? Paul believes one God, no idols, don't blaspheme, don't kill, steal, commit adultery. 9 out of the 10 commandments, right? I think, didn't Paul Fredrickson write that? The 9 commandments some years ago of like Paul's saying Sabbath is optional because Paul's talking to Gentiles. And if you got to work on Saturday, work on Saturday. It's no big deal. And I think Matthew kind of sort of agrees like, well, you got to have a roof over your head and food on the table. But if you can not work on Saturday and keep that commandment, wouldn't that be better? Because it's kind of a big one to just say, and it doesn't matter anymore. Because those Sabbath controversies in the Synoptics are, if you read the Mishnah, it's just what rabbis are doing. They're debating how much exertion counts as work so as to break the commandment of working on Sabbath. Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is never saying, that was a dumb commandment. Just forget about it. Do all the work you want, right? It's that the disciples are plucking the heads of the grain on the Sabbath. They're not out there with sickles harvesting the whole field. It goes without saying that would be too much work. They'd be breaking the Sabbath. And if you read the Mishnah, you actually see that exactly what the disciples do. There's a rabbi who says, yeah, you can do that. You can take it, and for small animals, like for baby animals, like a little baby sheep or baby goat, you can pluck the carobs and you can rub it in your hands and you can hand feed them on the Sabbath so that they have enough food to survive, because it's your duty to preserve life on the Sabbath, and that's not too much work. So again, it's presupposed that you keep the Sabbath, even in Mark. But I do think Mark is more influenced by Paul, where Sabbath is optional. Food laws are clearly optional. But again, that's not an argument that Jews would be having. Like, Jews were never telling Gentiles everywhere to stop eating pork. I'm from Tennessee and I live in Kentucky and I love pork barbecue. No Jews ever said, stop it. Right? Yeah. The idea is, those laws were given to us, and we got to keep those laws. Those laws are not given to you. You don't have to keep those laws. So in that sense, there's not a wider debate, but it's very easy to relax a commandment to tell Gentiles they don't have to keep those commandments and sound like you're abolishing them altogether. So Matthew is very keen to have Jesus say explicitly, do not think I came to abolish Torah. And so he is trying to bring in like, hey, nobody's going to keep every single commandment, but maybe you should try to. It wouldn't hurt to try. It does give you the right guide.
Just so I make sure I know you mentioned this in passing to some degree, but his phrasing, and I didn't want to leave anything hanging in the super chat, Does Papias's Petrine framing represent an early Catholicizing attempt to harmonize Jerusalem and Gentile missions? Is it that deep, or is it not that deep? Is it simpler to saying he thinks?
I don't know. I've got this pet theory that I've never dared to publish, so I'll just say it here. Okay. Because we don't hear about the Gospel of Peter until like Tertullian or thereabouts, like around 200. And so but I think it's probably earlier than that. And I cannot help but wonder if this idea that Mark is Peter's gospel comes about once someone has a gospel of Peter. That what we know of is a harmony of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but one that gave you the resurrection account that they all left out. So let me tell you something you don't know, but we don't have the entire Gospel of Peter, but what we have of it, we know is derivative of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, plus filling in gaps that they left out. And it's part of this proliferation of gospel writing. It claims to be written by Peter, because in the first person, I, Peter, was going to go fishing after and it sets up the whole scene in John 21. So it already knows all of that. And I like I say, I just, in the back of my mind, it just gnaws away at me. I cannot help but think that somebody's got a gospel that they claim that Peter himself wrote, and the rest of the church is saying, that's not one of our gospels. We need to have Peter's gospel. Who's this Mark guy? Well, luckily we got a letter attributed to Peter that mentions a guy named Mark. Let's have Mark be Peter's gospel. And now, that's getting a little bit anachronistic because Papias comes long before any mention of the Gospel of Peter. So that's why I can't defend it any better than that. Like I say, it's just this gnawing suspicion that somebody's got a Gospel of Peter. That's what I want to be the reason for associating Mark with Peter. But I don't know if that's too far-fetched, even for my friends. They might say, I don't buy it. And I'd be fine with that. I'd say, I don't know either. I know we can't prove it. And I know that we're several decades apart in making the dating work conveniently. But you got to admit, like, it's not a full-on conspiracy theory. It kind of makes sense when you think about it. Once somebody says, I've got Peter's gospel for the growing little O Orthodox, little C Catholic church to say, no, you don't. We've already had Peter's gospel. It's called the Gospel According to Mark.
Interesting. I'd love to see you publish on that someday. Hard work 8395. Thank you so much for the super chat. This is a good question, by the way. Did studying the Diatessaron give you a different perspective or important insight into the Gospels?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely, it did. As I was writing this book, I wrote this book, which was originally just going to be an article that took on a life of its own and became a book. It absolutely has influenced my view of gospel writing. I went down the rabbit hole of the Diatessaron because we both know a lot about it, but a lot of what we know is how little we know about it. And so we're constantly trying to backfill what can we say, how certain can we be about what Tatian's Diatessaron looked like. And the closest we can get to it is the Arabic Diatessaron. And Mina Monnier is working on a definitive critical edition of it in Arabic, but also with an English translation. It will be the single most monumental contribution to Diatessaron studies in 250 years. It's going to be worth the wait. He's a fabulous scholar, and I've gotten the chance to meet him, and we've corresponded quite a bit. And hopefully, we'll co-author something that I have cooking. But what the Diatessaron shows you, when we know for a fact that Tatian's sources are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is that Tatian can take anything he wants from anywhere and relocate it to anywhere else. And the prime example of this, and this was the article that then launched the book. Fundamental question I had, because I think we all have, if we've read John and the Synoptics, is John tells you that when Jesus goes and he disrupts the commerce in the temple in Jerusalem, makes a big scene. I love to call it, as others have, the temple tantrum, right? That is the first Passover. That is so early, like within a couple of weeks of Jesus's ministry starting, and it's 2 years before the Passion. Well, we get that story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the one and only Passover associated with Jesus's ministry. And for Matthew and Mark, it's the week that he dies. And so you say, well, what happened? Well, Augustine will say, oh, well, it happened twice. And so I thought, well, what did Tatian do with this? And I'm thinking, surely somebody has said this. And no, and I couldn't find anyone who had solved this simple question. What he does is say, Jesus there were 3 Passovers during Jesus' ministry, just as John says. He didn't disrupt the commerce at the first of them, and he didn't disrupt it at the third of them, which would be Passion Week. It was actually the second of 3 Passovers where he disrupted the commerce in the temple. And so that is as big and bold a move as you can make to solve a discrepancy between John and the Synoptics. Because I'll always pose this to my students when I teach. I'll spend one day on the Diatessaron in my intro class, and I'll say, what would you do? And half of them will say, well, I would just have an early one and a late one. That's what he does, by the way, when he has the woman who anoints Jesus. He has Luke's early scene, and then he harmonizes Matthew, Mark, and John for the one 6 days before the Passion, and it's Mary of Bethany. So the both and all of the above works great. The other half of my class will say, well, majority rules. 3-1, the Synoptics win on this one. I would put it at the Passion. And I say, those are both great solutions, and you should write your own harmony. It's not what Tatian did. He put it at the second of 3 and chose none of the above, and it's one of those light bulb moments of, you could do that? He takes a whole bunch of people, a whole bunch of scenes from different places, different times, none of them, though, in Jerusalem at the Feast of Sukkot. And he's like, let's put all of them here, one after another, all these people who had some issue or question about money. Let's line them up and put them in a parade, and they all just come through one after another, and Jesus talks about money at Sukkot in Jerusalem. The Sukkot in Jerusalem is only in John's Gospel. But all those money questions are only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then none of them are in Jerusalem. So when Tatian exercises that much authorial prerogative to tell the stories that you know good and well from the Gospels, and stories that he knows good and well that you know good and well, he still takes the time and the freedom to put them elsewhere. And I said, that's already going on in the Gospels. And I always cite Greg Carey's article on the Gospel of Luke, moving things ahead, that the anointing woman is just something that Luke takes. You know it at the end of the Gospels. I'm going to put it way early in Jesus's ministry. It's just something Luke characteristically does. So when you see Luke doing it, when you see Tatian reordering things, it absolutely influences my understanding of what it means to be a gospel writer. What it means to be a gospel writer is to have great freedom, to exercise great freedom with how you rework your sources. And it's what keeps me away from the historical Jesus questions of, well, what really happened? When did he actually do it? And I have to be agnostic on that and say, I don't know when. I mean, really back me into a corner. I don't know if it happened, but I'm no mythicist, right? I think Jesus did cause a disruption in the temple, and I think it's part of what got him killed. If I had to choose, I would say it probably happened the week that he died and got him killed. And John is a little bit embarrassed by that and moves it much earlier. But, I wouldn't stake anything great on that. But did a woman anoint Jesus? Sure, why not? Did more than one woman anoint Jesus? Maybe. But what I think Luke is actually doing is introducing you to all those women who follow Jesus all along, all the way from the Galilee. Because when you read Matthew and Mark, you get to the crucifixion scene. The disciples have fled and deserted Jesus, but the women are there. You know, the women who followed Jesus all along. And if you've read Matthew and Mark, you're like, I don't know. I've read your whole gospel up to this point. You never mentioned any women. What do you mean there were women there the whole time? Well, Luke takes the anointing woman and then says Mary Magdalene and these other women were there all along, all the way from the Galilee, supporting Jesus's ministry. So he moves an episode ahead as a way to eliminate the element of surprise that comes later. That seems to me a literary motive, not a historical one. So when Luke says, I'm writing you an orderly account, I don't think what he means is I'm putting everything in the exact chronological order that it happened. I think by orderly account, he means in terms of, if you look at rhetorical handbooks, how to write a narrative, that things need to make logical sense. I need to adduce the women who followed Jesus all the way from the Galilee, way back early in the Galilee, so that when they show up at the cross, it's no big surprise. And in that way, he's improving upon Matthew and Mark. Take that and then put an exponent, and you have what Tatian does with the Gospels. But he gives you all of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, just not in any of the order that they have. 3 Passovers is as close as you get, but he's given you half of the material from the Synoptics before we get to the first Passover. So he takes great freedom in rewriting things. And I could talk all day about Tatian, but yeah, it was a huge influence to say, once we see that degree of liberty, that when I sit down to write a new gospel, I can do whatever I want by carving up my sources. Tatian does it to such an extent that I think, hey, well, what if we just see John doing this and rewriting very creatively in a way that Tatian doesn't, because he's very slavish in word for word copying, right? But what if we see John as taking this other kind of liberty? We see Luke taking the liberties of relocating well-known stories and putting them where you do not expect them. Nobody's got a problem with Luke doing that.
Yeah.
St. Augustine has to say, well, Luke wrote it down as he remembered it. And so that's why it's out of order. It's a little bit of a cop-out, or it's a gigantic cop-out, but he's at least acknowledging, like, hey, this stuff's in a different order when you read the Gospels.
You and I will do a Tatian episode just on your book about Tatian.
Awesome.
For sure. The UX design guys, 823, thank you for the super chat. Is Dr. Dan McClellan, I believe they're talking about, right about John 1:1, divine?
Help me here with Dan's argument here.
That's a good question.
Do I think that John 1:1 is claiming Jesus' divinity? Absolutely. If that's the question, and it's such a high Christology, I call it creator Christology. We only see it in the Gospel of John, in Colossians, and in Hebrews in the New Testament. The idea that the Son of God is the agent through whom all things are created. So what that does for John is, without saying so explicitly, because remember, he's eliminated all the exorcisms. Jesus is not an exorcist in the Gospel of John. But what happens is, if you read the Old Testament, the sons of God gets translated in Hebrew, the B'nai Elohim, sometimes as angeloi theos, like as the angels of God. And so the sons of God, if you read the Septuagint or if you read the Tanakh, sons of God just means angels. And then if you have this theology that we get after we get the Maccabean revolt, and we get the devil, and we get heaven and hell, angels and demons, and the demons working mischief in the world. Once we get all of that, the idea, I think, in the exorcism stories in the Synoptics is that the demons recognize Jesus as Son of God because it takes one to know one. Mm-hmm. And they're like, hey, I know you. What are you doing here? And that's what they say, right? When Jesus casts them all into the pigs and they run off the cliff, are you here to torture us before the time? So one, they know that he is a divine being like them, but they also know that he has some kind of authority over them, but it's unclear. It's not fully worked out. John has a problem with that. And because if Jesus is just another angel, then it's a problem. So saying all things have been created through him is saying Jesus as the Son of God not only pre-existed before he came into the world, because you can get that from Philippians and the Christ hymn, as it's called. We don't know if it was really a hymn, but this idea that Jesus pre-existed and then was born. But that pre-existence doesn't entail that he created the universe, right? So John is saying he created all things. So angels, demons, all of it. Jesus was there before that. And so his sonship, I think John is very Trinitarian. And there's been a lot of good work on this. And so I ended up in my Christology chapter saying this. Like this is all of this later Trinitarian thought, I don't think it's anachronistic in the sense that those councils hadn't happened yet. But it's not anachronistic in the sense that that the Gospel of John is already trying to work out how it is that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit interrelate, and that they are unique in a way that Jesus is not just another angel.
Gotcha. Just so I can be clear what Dan is saying, according to AI overview, and I think I watched the video first couple minutes, but I didn't watch the whole thing. According to Dan McClellan, John 1:1 does not identify the Word as the specific God of Israel, but rather states the Word was divine or possessed deity. He argues that the anathros, I'm not sure.
Anarthros, yeah. Anarthros. Without the definite article.
Yeah. Greek noun theos in the predicate, kai theos in hologos, functions qualitatively rather than identifying the word with the subject ho theos, God. So
yeah, I would see it as higher. I don't think the lack of the definite article is that big of a problem with that identification. I think when later theologians say, well, there's a divine substance, that the Father and the Son have to have a distinctiveness, and yet they have a unity. All of that's there in John, right? All the problems are there for you in John because the Son is like in the womb of the Father.
Right.
And then you're like, does that mean the begetting happened at some moment, before we could measure time? And that's why we have the Council of Nicaea to say, no, the Son has to be eternally begotten. But you get that with in the beginning, the word's already there. So how do you get back before the beginning? John's gospel poses all of the problems, all of the interpretive problems that later councils have to work out. But yeah, I think that the sonship is divinity, is like when Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I and the Father are one. Well, he also prays to the Father, so they're distinct and yet they're united. And so that's all later Trinitarian theology, is the outworkings of, well, what does that really mean? And what I think is what we see at Nicaea in 325, what we see at really importantly at Constantinople in 381, that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are all working together in a coordinated fashion at all times, in creation, in the revelation of prophecy, etc. What that determination at the Council of Constantinople in 381 is, I think, exactly what John is trying to do. John's understanding of prophecy, that the Father speaks the word and the Spirit is what illuminates the understanding of the prophetic word that was spoken. That gives you a way that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit all have to be interacting and working in a coordinated fashion for prophecy to work.
Right.
Because God can just speak the word and humans won't understand it.
Got you.
Like, well, I've got the Father and I've got the word. Enter the Spirit to give you the understanding of what all of this meant. And John gives you that.
So someone might try to and before we move from the super chat, because it comes to mind, I remember Alex O'Connor used this in a debate against a Christian apologist who was trying to bring in the two powers of heaven idea to try and like capitalize on showing why Jesus did claim to be God in all the gospels. And Alex points out, even in the Gospel of John, I am in you and the Father's in me and I'm in the Father. But then he's like, may you also be in the Father. So like what Alex kind of brings out to go a little further is to go, well, shouldn't we then expand the Trinity of God into a much larger divinity with all these humans who are now becoming divine as well? Because they're participating in that triune essence by being in him. You see where it goes if you follow the logic?
Well, I would say no, because Jesus in John's Gospel in chapter 20 very clearly breathes the Spirit into them. He does. It's called the Johannine Pentecost, right? And so, like, don't be upset that I'm leaving you guys behind. Because I'm going to send you, the Paraclete, the Helper, the Comforter, the Spirit is what he means, right? The Spirit's going to come and enable you to do all this stuff, greater stuff than I've done. So I think in that sense, and that's where. Especially Greek Orthodox theology, the idea of this apotheosis, right? That the God becomes human so that humans can become God, in that sense, but not in the sense like that. There is a fundamental differentiation between the Creator and the creation,
right?
And so that human beings as created things and elevating Jesus to the role of Creator, I think is such a qualitative distinction that humans never can fully, you can't expand beyond the Trinity. And I understand why people don't accept the Trinity. It's a hard thing to believe, right? I mean, it's the, is it Tertullian? Like, I believe it because it's absurd, which I think it's misused a lot, but he's trying to say like, it's so crazy. Nobody would make this up, right? It just has to be. He's much more sophisticated intellectually than that statement can sometimes let on. But I get the idea, right? That it is so complicated that I don't know that we'll ever fully figure it out. But I think John is already trying to. I think John is a Trinitarian thinker, and he's trying to think, I've got a Father, I've got a Son, and a Spirit. What do I do with them? What do they do? How do they work? And then what happens at Constantinople is to say, well, they all have to be working in a coordinated fashion. They're not designated different tasks. It wasn't the Father who created, like it's the triune God who created. Because I was just shaped by the Christian tradition, those are always my questions. If I were raised Jewish, I'd be like, there's no Trinity. Stop it already, right? I understand why Jews don't believe the Trinity. I don't think they should. I think they should stay Jews. I understand why Muslims don't believe the Trinity, and I'm not trying to proselytize Muslims into believing the Trinity. But within the Christian tradition, I think you do have a Trinity. You have a Father, a Son, and a Spirit, and you have all of this work to try to understand how they work. And I think John is kicking off this Trinitarian thinking. Paul's just giving you a Father, a Son, and a Spirit. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are just giving you a Father, a Son, and a Spirit. John's the one who's going to tell you, here's a way that they work in a coordinated fashion. It just took the rest of the church almost 300 years to come around to, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Humans will be humans. Victor Engelman, thank you so much for the super chat. Mark 1:1 versus 2 Thessalonians 1:8. Is Mark the gospel of Paul?
Well, pull up 2 Thessalonians 1:8 for me.
Okay.
I know 1 Thessalonians better than I know 2 Thessalonians, but
let me do this here. Let's do, I don't want to do NIV, but I guess let's see.
That's all right.
Yeah.
It's about 99% the same as NRSV anyway.
Okay. Here we go. Let me crop it in a little here. All right. 1:8. Okay. So you don't need the other one open. You know what that is. He will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus.
Yeah. I don't see any conflict with Mark 1:1 of the beginning of the gospel, Jesus Christ, Son of God. And for what it's worth, I think that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. I'm not convinced that that's later. I think it's of a very different kind. Like when we get to Colossians, Ephesians, the pastoral epistles, Hebrews, it's somebody other than Paul. Second Thessalonians, I'm fine with Paul having written. And is Mark Paul's gospel? Yes, in the sense that Mark is Pauline. Is Mark behind the gospel of Paul? Well, I don't think so. I don't think there's any written gospel. I think Paul dies before anybody had a chance to write a gospel. I always ask my students, in-person students, true false question. When Paul talks about my gospel in his letters, he's referring to the Gospel of Luke. Try as I may in the Bible Belt, a third to half the class will write. They'll circle true for that one. And
wow.
And the first day I teach Paul, I say, hey, I give a timeline, and I say Paul died before any of our gospels were written. And you need to know that because he's repeatedly going to say things like my gospel, the gospel. And all he means is what I preach. So yeah, Mark is the most Pauline gospel. Luke is a close second because he does want to rehabilitate Paul and like swing the pendulum to the middle and be the moderate because Matthew's so anti-Pauline. But I don't think Paul's dictating Mark. Mark's reading some of Paul's letters, but all of our gospel writers are reading some of Paul's letters. And Robin Walsh and I have talked about this. Like for us, that is the frontier. Folks like Cameron Evan Ferguson, I've mentioned. Sorry to butcher his name. How much of each gospel of each of Paul's letters do you need to have X, Y, or Z in such and such gospel? Like that's where I think we need to spend our time and say, well, got to have 1 Corinthians to get the Eucharistic stuff you get in Mark. Forget about Luke quoting it word for word. Mark's already writing it basically like that. I think is a huge, huge contribution. And I think we should start there. I think Matthew's got Galatians because he's really reactionary against it, right? And he's got the Corinthian correspondence too, and he knows that Paul doesn't deserve to be an apostle. So because that's the debate. Paul's asking, "Am I not an apostle?" Luke writes Acts and tells you Peter's the one who said Paul's not an apostle because Peter in Acts chapter 1 lays out the criteria for being an apostle. You have to have been there the whole time from Peter's perspective to count as an apostle. For Paul, all you have to have is a revelation of the risen Jesus. So there's hundreds of them out there. But Luke comes around to calling Paul an apostle, and he calls Barnabas an apostle. And the Didache tells us that there are a bunch of apostles out there who might just show up at your church, and you should receive them as the Lord. It's easy to pass that over as the Lord. What he means is Jesus is gone. He's up in the sky. When an apostle comes to you, it is as though the Lord Jesus Christ himself is there. And you do exactly what they say.
No wonder you have such power structures and people trying to pass the baton on so that you better respect me, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And our authority. So
yeah,
they give you that continuity. You could see this being totally used by high church.
It's being abused already in the Didache because Christians are so hospitable and charitable. And that's where you get, therefore, appoint for yourselves bishops and deacons so that maybe you don't need these charismatic prophets and apostles coming to you who might ask you for money or who might want to take up residence and not keep moving from town to town. So the Didache, I think, is very early and reflecting that very messy situation of both charismatic authorities and institutional authorities that are clashing. And when you get to Clement, I'm not an apostle. I'm just a mere bishop. But there's no room for prophetic authority. But read the Shepherd of Hermas and what happens. Hermas gets this prophetic revelation, and the angel says, the shepherd says, write this down and take the book to Clement. Because Clement will respect the book, and now what does the bishop do with that? There's a clash there in the apostolic fathers with First Clement and with Shepherd of Hermas. Of the Didache's in there too, saying, hey, there's a rivalry going on between the early episcopacy and the prophets and apostles. I think it's already there in Shepherd of Hermas and First Clement. They're duking it out. But as we know, the episcopacy is what wins out, but not for a while. But I think that messy situation's already there in Paul. It's how I always teach Philippians. I don't think it's an accident that Philippians 1:1 is one of those letters where Paul does not identify himself as an apostle, because he explicitly writes to the apostles and the bishop. I'm sorry, the bishops and the deacons who are in the church at Philippi. So I think it's reflective of that early, messy, contentious situation. And Paul, once or twice, can play nice and doesn't want to step on their toes.
Oh my gosh. The mess gets messier, ladies and gentlemen. Lithius, I believe I pronounced this right. Forgive me if I mess up your name. What do you think of the idea that Jesus is a replacement of Jacob, Israel? Israel was broken, and Jesus is the new Israeli state. Thoughts?
Boy, there's a lot of supersessionism baked into to all of our Gospels, all of Paul's letters, the entire Christian tradition, and it is unavoidable and it is unmistakable. But I do think that it can be taken too far, and that for much of Christian tradition, it has been taken too far. So I think it is much more a both and, not an either or. So when I read those, so we talked about controversy stories earlier, things like Sabbath controversies, or why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat, the traditions of the elders. In Matthew and Mark, notice it's the disciples, which implies that Jesus himself does wash his hands before he eats. And then Luke rewrites it so that Jesus doesn't wash his hands. So he makes Jesus break one of the traditions of the elders, because it's not explicitly a Torah commandment that applies to anyone but priests in the temple. And Pharisees are kind of the wannabe priests who are keeping these priestly rituals in the private home. Something that makes especially good sense once the temple was gone, mind you, and the Gospels are written, right? So you have excavations of private homes with mikvahs in them. So we know that people are waking up, and if they were ritually impure because of their sexual actions maybe the night before, they dip in the mikvah. Now they're ritually pure. They don't have to be unless they're going to temple, but we know that people are wanting to be in their private homes. So is it broken? Well, it's broken in a sense, because Jesus is saying in Matthew chapter 10, don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and bring them in. So there are a lot of sheep who have gone astray. Bring them back into the sheepfold. But what's not broken is Torah itself, because what you do is bring them back in. And so, Jesus is, hanging out with the sinners and the tax collectors. He's never said to associate with prostitutes. It's a big misconception. But say he was. I imagine Fred Pharisee saying, "Hey, Jesus, if you can hang out with a prostitute and bring them back into the fold, like good for you." Like I tend not to do that. I don't attempt that because I'm afraid of the temptation. If I went to a prostitute, I'm afraid I'd end up paying her for sex. So I'm going to stay away from prostitution at all costs. But if you can do it and successfully bring people back into the fold, that's a great thing. It's not Torah that's broken. There's a brokenness that not everybody's keeping all the commandments, right? You'll see rabbis say things jokingly like, well, if all the Jews would just keep the Sabbath on the same Sabbath, the Messiah would come. Because there's always going to be somebody breaking the Sabbath for one reason or another, consciously or unconsciously. So So yeah, the brokenness, I think, has to do with the human condition, not the idea of Torah as divinely given. I think what Jesus sees his mission as is bring everybody in that we can. Does that then end up with a replacement theology where the church replaces Israel? Yes, unfortunately. But I do think that particularly since Vatican II, there's been a lot of good theological work to say, hey, we don't have to read it that way. You can have the parallel tracks, and we're on the same path. And I studied under A.J. Levine, and she puts this beautifully. She says, in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, the idea is if Jews and Christians are like separate rails, they're parallel lines, they never meet. And she says very astutely, yes, they do, on the horizon, right? From our human perception, because we can only see so far. Train tracks do meet eventually, and that's how we should think of Judaism and Christianity as separate religions.
Gotcha. Hey, just to give everybody a heads up, we have 19 minutes till I have to send Dr. Barker on his way because I want him to come back and join us for these kinds of discussions. By the way, I've been having a blast, James. How do you feel?
Love it.
Good. Okay.
Love your audience.
Some bright minds out there, really. A few more here. And Bakken, thank you so much for the super chat. Where did Paul pull the Eucharist, baptism, etc. from?
Yeah, great question. I think it's happening early, and I would say that it goes back to Jesus and the disciples, and having a ritual meal is not an unknown thing in any religion, right? And having an initiation rite is not foreign to any religion. So I do think that it's there. The baptism stuff, it is. I'm not saying that Jesus and John the Baptist were Essenes at Qumran, okay? But we do. I mentioned the mikvah, that we see people in their private homes who are wanting to stay ritually pure. We see it happening daily at Qumran. John the Baptist is doing something different. It's something very similar, right? That you have this baptism for the repentance of sins, a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, as Mark puts it. And so I do think that it is already there, and that it's something that Jews are doing, and it's something that they're not exclusively doing at the temple, which is important, because I mentioned with ritual purity, if you come to the temple in Jerusalem for, say, to participate in a sacrificial offering, you have to be ritually pure. And most Jews are ritually impure most of the time because of all of the things that make you impure. So you dip in the mikveh and now you're pure. It's not a problem. There's plenty of great literature on this. Jonathan Clawans, for one, understanding like ritual purity is not the same as moral purity. To be ritually impure does not make you morally impure. So we see a lot of dipping in water as symbolic of making you pure. So that's out there enough to say that by the time of Paul, from the earliest, we know, going back to Jesus, Jesus has in Matthew, it's the Great Commission where the disciples are told to perform baptism as this initiation rite. But John chapter 3, at the end of it, he already has baptism, right? It's like they're baptizing for 2 years. They're already baptizing during Jesus's ministry. So I don't think it's something Paul made up. I think it's something he already found. And I would say it goes back to Jesus and the disciples. And to me, Eucharist, it makes just as much sense to see that going back to Jesus and the disciples, as opposed. I don't think it's anything he made up. I think it's something he already knows the earliest churches are doing.
Interesting.
And as a tangent to that question, I don't think that Paul is a church planter. We get this line in Romans where he's really playing nice once or twice, because that's Peter's church. And so he says, "Oh, I don't like to go. I want to come see you, but I tend not to go places where others have preached. I don't want to step on anybody's toes. I'll just, go. He says that in Romans. I get it. I understand where this kind of mythology of Paul, the church planter, comes from. But you know what else he says in 1 Corinthians is, well, I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you. And it's total stream of consciousness, which I love. Like, he didn't even bother to edit this letter. He's like, well, I did baptize Crispus and Gaius, but beyond that, I didn't. But maybe I baptized a few people. Anyway,
yeah.
If there's this church at Corinth that does not accept, some of the members do not accept Paul as an apostle, why on earth would we think that Paul planted that church? Right?
Yeah.
They know Peter, they know Apollos. Some of them like Paul, because Paul baptized a few of them. I think that they were already baptized. I mean, in Galatians, what does he say? Well, yeah, I was there and I preached to you. Now somebody else has preached to you. Well, what it means to call yourself an apostle is to go different places and preach. I think he's just, most of the time, is just walking into a church that already existed. And he preaches the way the Didache puts it out. Again, that's not something I've published, but I'm glad to share it here because I think we have this mistaken notion that Paul is founding all of these churches. I think he's finding these churches.
Interesting. He's hunting them down for his own gospel. I will say
and
this.
And then he presents his gospel, but he already knows that there's a ritual meal. He already knows there's a baptism. He can perform a baptism. I mean, come on, Crispus, I don't mind, but that's not his main job, right?
Gotcha. Hey, we got one more super chat here, and I just want to make a comment just to make this point for the audience. I did a deep dive on baptism for the dead, and I found no Jewish sources whatsoever, but I found several ancient Orphic and Dionysian sources and contemporaneous Greco-Roman mystery religion sources for baptizing on behalf of the dead. So I kind of wonder about this syncretic Hellenistic Jewish stuff going on. Anyway, that's a whole rabbit trail from just general baptism.
Yeah, but Paul says it in Corinthians. Like, well, why else would you be baptized on behalf of the dead if Jesus hasn't been raised? And a lot of people. I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist who have tons of anti-Mormonism, which I think is highly problematic because it's a typical Mormon practice to be baptized on behalf of the dead. And I'm like, it's literally what it means in Corinthians, that is something that was being done. So it's fine that over the course of tradition that falls out of favor in most Christian circles. But I think it's also fine that other people are like, well, that's there in Scripture. They're not making it up. But I'd be interested in what else you've seen of that I could do something on someone else's behalf. Run all the way to Dante, right? That's why we have not everybody, but a lot of people mistake limbo as purgatory. No, limbo is like where we've got to have Plato and Aristotle, right? Like, we can't have them in hell. They're too smart for that.
That's why
they at least knew that pagan religion was BS, right? So it's cold out there and it's not pleasant, but they can at least talk philosophy for all eternity. And so
right.
I mean, that's not full on baptism for the dead, but it's like a scare quotes baptism.
I'm talking direct
redeeming
language.
them. Like, you mean it literally.
I mean, like, in the Greek, they are being baptized on behalf of dead loved ones. And it's to help. It's almost like purgatory in a sense, where they help their loved ones get through. Yeah.
I can see why somebody would do that. If you're telling me in the first century that I am going to spend an eternity in a fiery hell because I did not worship the right God and understand the mystery that God had a son.
Right.
And I'm thinking about deceased parents, grandparents, wife, children. I would, if I'm a believer in that religion, I would be very worried about my loved ones who have died.
Right.
And if someone gave me the option to say, well, you can do this for them, I would do that. So
yeah, and I think that we're talking late Second Temple, Hellenistic Judaism anyway. So that's why I figure there might be something going on. Just so I make sure I hit this one, because I don't want to leave us hanging, because we're having so much fun, and they wanted me to push you to get through questions so they could get to this, but I wasn't going to leave you hanging. Trust me, because James, you have so much insight. We have to do more, by the way. You know a lot of stuff.
To.
The UX design guy is back again. 823. Thank you for the super chat. Can divine agency explain Jesus as God for John?
Oh, that's tricky. Yeah, it's absolutely Jesus is exerting divine agency. And John wants you to understand that, particularly in creation, that he's like the agent,
right,
in creation. And the logos is the agent through whom all things came into being. So in that sense, to be a divine agent who was there from the beginning, to me, is divinity. And sometimes, especially when I talk to patristic scholars, I'll talk about angels and demons as divine beings, because I just mean they're immortal. You can't kill an angel. Believe me, I've tried. I always joke. But it's I mean, they're scary. It's why they always say, like, don't be afraid. Well, why would you be afraid? Because angels are scary as hell. Have you read the descriptions of what these people look like? So they're divine beings in that sense, but they're not divine in the sense that God is, or I think for John that Jesus is, or for John that the Spirit is. Now it does get really complicated, and Raymond Brown, I mean, the greatest Johannine scholar of the 20th century, he really gets at this. Like, it is messy when you look at the Paraclete and the Spirit who comes. Like, is that just Jesus? Like, that's so much Jesus. Like, this is a devout Catholic who's at least saying, boy, it kind of sounds that way. But yeah, I think it's enough to get you there, right there in the beginning of the Gospel of John. That says literally in the beginning that Jesus is God's divine agent. And I just would qualify in a way that the angels are not. The angels are these emissaries. They exercise an agency on behalf of God. But what Jesus does as in that creative act that brings those emissaries into being, those immortal beings into being, it does create a superiority that I do think sets up all of that messiness that Trinitarian theology has to work out. I think John very intentionally wants to raise that Christology that high, and how John, Colossians, and Hebrews are interrelated. I'm going to give a paper on that at Society of Biblical Literature in November, to say I haven't worked it out, because I can make a good case for a lot of different ones. So let me at least lay out the cases and see if I can, between now and November, figure out that I lean one way or the other. But yeah, I think that divine agency is the starting point for John, and it should be enough. And with or without the definite article, I mean, we can debate that, and we in a nice, friendly way, and say, yeah, how much of God and how much distinction between the Father and the Son, because this is what later Trinitarian theologians always come up with, right? Fathers come before their sons, right? My father was here before I was, existed before me, and I existed before my son. That's just how biology works. And so then you say, yeah, but there is this kind of sort of mystical continuity, right? When I really kind of think very deeply and personally about my relationship to my father and my relationship to my son, there's a continuity there that is sort of surpassing my understanding, my human comprehension. And then for later theologians to say, and our human language is just going to break down anytime we try to pin down exactly, precisely in our limited human comprehension the divine. Well, we can only go so far. And I sympathize with that, because, like I say, if you think about it strictly in human terms, like, for me as a son and as a father, that yeah, I get that one precedes the other, but I also feel a very strong sense of continuity there that to me is very deeply meaningful and kind of corresponds to this Trinitarian speculation. So
Yeah. I got a question to follow up real quick before we wrap things up in just a few minutes. And this is just Doc showed some love today. I don't want to leave Doc hanging in case he's still in the chat. And if he's not, I'll tell him to go back and watch this because I know him personally.
awesome.
When he asked his initial super chat, I would like to pull it up, but you know which one I'm talking about, where he was bringing up Papias and why I mentioned Mark as like writing down for Peter. He was wanting to kind of give the suggestion, or at least give the idea to you to think about, was that it was ecclesial diplomacy, retroactively placing a potential Gentile-leaning gospel under Jerusalem's most prestigious apostolic umbrella. So making Mark Petrine is a way of kind of like doing what Luke was doing somewhat.
Okay.
And we
okay,
a
co-op thing, if I put it more crudely.
In some way, there's something going on there, because there are scholars who think the prologue of Luke, some conversations happening between Papias and Luke, some suggest. I don't know what your thoughts are on
I
that.
see.
But anyway.
No, that I do think works too.
Okay.
To say, if you put Mark as subservient to Peter,
yes,
then you definitely have to tone down how thoroughgoingly Pauline Mark is,
right?
Because you need, but then that Dr. Pleroman doesn't say it this way, but this touches on something you and I have talked about. The early Christians are book collectors, so I think that the book collection, you just read George Houston's Inside Roman Libraries is a brilliant work. When we look at actual libraries and book collections, what we see with Justin Martyr is he's collecting Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, potentially the infancy Gospels too. Hard to say. Yeah. We know that Tatian's collected the 4 Gospels. We know Justin's got Paul too, by the way. Just doesn't mention him because he so hates Marcion. But Justin's theology cannot be what it is without Paul.
Right.
We see Justin collecting the Septuagint and its earliest known recension when he works with the minor prophets. So people who wrote Gospels knew that they were writing, the Gospel writing is proliferating, that epistles, the Christian epistles are proliferating. They're all circulating, and you can add to the pile. And what people do is collect multiple sources. So I would tack on to what that statement is it presupposes a collection of gospel books.
Got it.
And then saying, how do we order them? How do we rank them? How do we sort them? And I do think that carries some explanatory power to say it's a power play to associate Mark with Peter, because on my reading, Mark's gospel is so thoroughly Pauline.
Right.
Maybe the early church did recognize that and recognize it as a problem once Matthew's gospel's there. Not an accident that Matthew, almost 10-1, I mean, is like the most quoted gospel in the early church. So I could see that playing out in that kind of disputation of, now what do we do with Mark? Do we let Mark and Paul carry all the way on, or does somebody in Jerusalem want to say, now hold on, wait a hot minute, and let's put these gospels in their place? Yeah, I could see that. And then Matthew and Sermon on the Mount is going to carry the day, and don't think I came to abolish the commandments. Not one commandment will pass away. But then to say Gentiles don't need to keep kosher or get circumcised, who's Paul arguing with? Right?
Yeah.
What Jew out there was saying, yeah, they do, right? And then Sabbath, well, we do get Gentiles who are not fully converts, the so-called God-fearers, who are members of synagogues, these uncircumcised Gentile men who are full-fledged members of synagogues. Who's Paul really arguing? Is this purely rhetorical in Galatians when he's saying, and by the way, you don't have to be circumcised, all of chapter 5, right?
Yeah.
Is there actually somebody saying, yeah, you do? I mean, maybe. Or is it hyperbole of, oh, you're saying you got to keep all the commandments? Well, line up and I'll sharpen my knife. No, right? So it is this debate of how much Torah do you have to keep? Because again, from a Christian perspective, yeah, you do have to ditch the paganism.
Yeah.
The one God, the no idols, the no blaspheming God, the murder, adultery. You can go on with the commandments that remain in force.
Yeah.
And so then you get to the specifically Jewish ones where kosher, like, well, okay, you aren't Jewish, so I don't expect you to keep kosher. There's an entire tractate in the Mishnah about eating with Gentiles. It's crazy, right? You have this line and acts of like, well, Jews just never ate with Gentiles. Of course they did. It's why there's an entire tractate in the Mishnah that tells you how to conduct yourself. If you excuse yourself for a few minutes and you come back to the table and a new bottle of wine has been opened and you don't know whether a little bit of it was poured out to Dionysus, you just put your hand over your cup and say, no, I'm good. Thank you. I don't need any more because I don't want to unwittingly participate in pagan worship. And so you have these ground rules but of what to do when you're eating with. So to be a minority in the Roman Empire meant you were constantly surrounded by paganism. So both to be Jewish and to be Christian meant, well, no more of that pagan stuff.
Right.
But then to be what we call early Christians meant how much of the Jewish stuff? Well, the stuff that tells you not to be pagan, right?
Right.
That commandment remains in force. Not working on Saturday. Boy, that was a big one. And it doesn't take long until Ignatius is like, no, we're worshiping on Sunday. We're working on Saturday. We have to distinguish ourselves from the Jews. And I understand how eventually you need enough separation to say we are doing something different. But I also understand how that sets a really bad precedent for Jewish-Christian relations that took some really nasty turns as the tradition carried through the centuries.
I agree. Real quick, shamelessly plugging you, get his latest, greatest writing and rewriting the Gospels, John and the Synoptics. I absolutely encourage everybody to get your heads wrapped around this. I feel like you're ahead of your time in terms of, or at least, like you've said, there are scholars in the past who've noticed these things, but you're like really pushing through here. And I hope more people will find your scholarship, get your books, show the appreciation, like the video that you're doing with me. It shows that you care. Drop a positive comment when the video's done, if you're watching this now or later, especially once this live stream is over. And of course, Dr. Barker, I'm looking forward to doing some work with you here, hopefully this summer, where we can actually get you to personally teach people, taking them through the class on various topics. We're going to start off, I think, with second century Christianity and all of that. That's going to be a fun one.
I think that's where we need to start. I think that's where so much of this happens. Ignatius and others, and then it gets pushed back as though it had happened earlier. Like, no, your New Testament leaves everything a mess. And it's the second century where so many of these decisions get made for better or worse. And I would love to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait. Any final words from you to our audience? I've kept you past the time by 4 minutes. I'm sorry.
Totally fine. It's been a pleasure. Love the time with you and your audience, and love the platform that you give, and appreciate the plugs for the book. If you want to know where writing and rewriting the Gospels came from, you can go back to my dissertation, John's use of Matthew, and you can buy it from me on eBay for shipping included is, I don't know, $10 or something.
Yeah.
I can point to the box of them I have. To get it reprinted, I bought back all the old ones. So actually, after last time I was on there, I had one eBay sale. It was like awesome. somebody wanted to check out the book.
I need to get
cheap,
the link.
It is kind of fun to go and say, okay, I can see what got you thinking of that. Because when I wrote that, nobody thought John was reading Matthew. Almost nobody. Franz Nijrink in Leuven in Belgium, he held strong on John's use of all three synoptics. Into the 90s, he was still publishing, I believe. And but it was definitely a minority position. And now you just find scholars saying, well, yeah, John probably knew all the synoptics. And you think, wow, okay. The field is ripe for the kind of work that I'm doing, that Mark Goodacre is doing. Others, we're not the only ones doing John and the Synoptics. Tyler Smith has done work on this. Who am I leaving out? Can't think of her name. The name, I see the face, but I can't think of the name. But yeah, there's Helen Bond is convinced that John knew the Synoptics. So. And she was one of the editors of the John's Transformation of Mark volume. So yeah, I think we're arriving there, and when Mark Goodacre, who's been so good and gracious to me from the beginning, when no one knew who I was, and supported my book project, my earliest work on ancient compositional practices, for his book to be there too, for Erdman's to put out both of our books in the course of a year. We are making a concerted effort to say we want the field to move in this direction, adopt the fairer solution to the synoptic problem, and see John as using all three synoptics. Michael Goulder had that same idea, and I should have mentioned him in my book. I was remiss not to. Again, I'm not the first to arrive at that, but I hope with this book, and you've read it, and so the style of it. Yeah. The way I'm talking to you and your audience here now is the way I talk throughout this book. It is a conversation. It is written for a popular audience. And so, it's not one of these books it's this thick, right? It's not 500 pages and half of every page is not a footnote. It's not that kind of book, because I want to popularize this idea and start with the simplest thing of, well, how did you even write? And leave no stone uncovered. Like, start with the most basic and build throughout, and plead guilty to being overly simplistic, because I think it's the rest of scholarship that's overly complicating everything needlessly. And so let's get back to basics and let's simplify everything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barker. Ladies and gentlemen, make sure you show him some love. Get the book. Stay tuned. We will have some courses soon. And thank you for your time, James. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone, never forget, we are Myth Vision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.